All right, ready to dive in? Today, we're going to trace the electrifying journey of electronic music, how it evolved right here in America.
You know, it's interesting because a lot of people, when they think electronic music, they think DJs, flashing lights, huge festivals.
Yeah, that's what comes to mind first, right? But there's so much more to it.
Absolutely. It's a whole sonic revolution that's been, well, it's been brewing for decades. We're talking way back, even before those massive festivals.
So we're going way back for this deep dive then.
Oh, yeah, we've got articles, interviews, even some old vinyl liner notes.
Wow, like proper digging into the crates. All right, so let's get this started. Where do we even begin with something like this?
Well, what I think is fascinating is how it all began, you know? Electronic music started out almost like a whisper, almost like a secret.
A secret.
Yeah, it was these pioneers, these sonic experimenters who weren't afraid to kind of push the boundaries, redefine what music even was, what it could be.
I love that. I love those kind of like origin stories. You see these seeds of creativity planted in the most unexpected places.
Exactly. And we're talking like mid-20th century here.
Yeah.
Think about it. Back then, most people, if they heard electronic sounds, they thought sci-fi.
Yeah, like those old space movies.
Right, or those like quirky novelty songs.
Yeah.
But then you had these radical thinkers like Raymond Scott. He was composing these super futuristic pieces using early synthesizers.
Wow, so he was already way ahead of his time.
Light years ahead. And get this, his music ended up in cartoons and commercials.
What? No way.
Yeah. It's wild. Like a whole generation got their first taste of electronic sounds without even realizing it.
That's amazing. It's like subliminal messaging, right? Like he was slowly rewiring everyone's brains to accept these new unconventional sounds.
Totally. But then you had someone like Wendy Carlos going in a completely different direction.
Oh, yeah, Wendy Carlos. That was a big deal.
Huge. She took this bold step with switched on Bach. Imagine Bach, but played entirely on a Moog synthesizer.
A Moog. Wow, it's almost like a sacred instrument, right?
Definitely iconic. And it wasn't just a novelty, you know. Switched on Bach blew people's minds. It bridged the gap between this classical tradition and this brand new electronic frontier. And you want to know the crazy part? It won 3 Grammys.
3 Grammys in 1969. That's wild.
It proved that electronic music could be more than just, you know, experimental noise in a lab.
Yep.
It could be beautiful, complex, and accepted, even celebrated.
It was like electronic music demanding its own seat at the table, showing that it could stand with the giants, you know.
Exactly. And, you know, speaking of influence, we can't forget Delia Derbyshire. She was British, but her work had a huge impact over here.
Oh, Delia Derbyshire, the Doctor Who thing.
That's the one. Groundbreaking stuff. Early 60s, she's using tape manipulation, electronic effects. It was like nothing anyone had heard before. A lot of American experimenters took notice.
That's so cool. It's amazing how one piece of music can spark a whole movement.
It's true. And speaking of sparking movements, there's Morton Subotnick. Can't forget him. His piece, Silver Apples of the Moon, in '67, that was a game changer.
What was so special about that?
Well, for one thing, he really embraced the LP, the album format. It wasn't just a collection of short pieces. It was a journey, you know, a sprawling sonic landscape that you had to experience as a whole.
I see. So he was thinking big, even back then.
Absolutely. He showed that electronic music could be immersive, complex, even a little challenging.
So we've got these pioneers laying the foundation, experimenting with synths, reimagining classical music, creating these soundscapes that were, what, decades ahead of their time?
Exactly. But how did this experimental kind of academic sound find its way to the dance floor? How did electronic music start making people move?
Yeah, that's a good question. That seems like a big leap.
That's where things get really interesting.
Yeah,
Because the 1970s brought this burst of energy. All this experimentation collided with this undeniable urge to move, to dance.
disco.
Bingo. Disco was the bridge. It fused that sonic innovation with the heartbeat of the dance floor.
And when you say disco, I mean, you can't talk about that without talking about Giorgio Moroder and Donna Summer.
Absolutely. Their track, I Feel Love, 1977, it's often called the first real electronic dance hit.
I can hear it now. But what made it so different, so groundbreaking?
Think about it. Before I Feel Love, disco was all about live instruments. But Moroder, he used synthesizers to create this entirely synthetic sound. Pulsating, hypnotic. It was like stepping into the future of music.
I get it. It's like he was painting with sound, but with these brand new colors that no one had ever seen before.
Exactly. The possibilities felt endless. It wasn't just about replicating old sounds anymore. It was about creating something entirely new.
And while disco was lighting up dance floors here in America, across the Atlantic, there was a band in Germany, Kraftwerk. They were doing something completely different, weren't they?
Kraftwerk, man, they were unique. Robotic rhythms, minimalist, stark, a world away from the glitz of disco.
But their music still had this undeniable groove.
Absolutely. And in those repetitive beats, those hypnotic synth lines, you can hear the seeds of what would become house and techno.
Wow, so they were planting those seeds even back then.
They were way ahead of the curve. It's like they sent this signal, this musical code, that American musicians would later pick up and run with.
This is amazing. All these different threads coming together, shaping the sound of the future. So we've got disco, we've got Kraftwerk. What happens next?
Well, that's where things get really interesting, because the 1980s, that's when two American cities, Chicago and Detroit, become these unlikely hubs for electronic music innovation.
Chicago, Detroit. That's interesting. Not the places you typically think of for this kind of musical revolution.
Exactly. It's like this raw experimental sound was bubbling up in these cities that were often overlooked.
The underground scene.
Precisely. And it's amazing how those two cities almost simultaneously gave birth to two distinct genres, house and techno.
House and techno, that's a whole other chapter in the story of electronic music. But before we dive into that, Chicago, Detroit, that's a whole other chapter in the story of electronic music. But before we dive into that, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the underground scene.
Right, because that's where all the real innovation was happening, away from the mainstream in these kind of hidden spaces.
It's like a whole secret world, right? Driven by passion, experimentation.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
it was in those underground spaces, in those cities, that the next chapter of electronic music would be written. It was a time of incredible energy, creativity just exploding.
So let's talk about those cities. You mentioned Chicago and Detroit. What was so special about them?
Well, think about it. These weren't, glamorous music hubs like New York or LA. These were industrial cities, gritty, real, and that energy, that rawness, it found its way into the music.
I see. So the music was a reflection of the environment, the culture.
Absolutely. And it was in Chicago that house music was born. Imagine this legendary club called the Warehouse, packed with people, all moving to these hypnotic beats spun by this DJ, Frankie Knuckles.
Frankie Knuckles, the godfather of house.
That's the one. He was a master at blending those soulful disco grooves with the raw power of drum machines, creating these long, extended mixes, keeping the energy going all night.
I've heard those mixes. They're incredible. It's like one continuous flow of energy.
Exactly. And it was all about creating this space for collective euphoria, this feeling of unity on the dance floor.
It sounds almost spiritual, doesn't it? Like this idea of music as a unifying force.
It was. It really was. But while house was electrifying Chicago, a different kind of energy was pulsing through Detroit. That's where techno was born.
Detroit techno, yeah, it's got a very distinct sound.
Oh, yeah. Raw, mechanical, almost industrial. It mirrored the city itself. Detroit, with its factories, its machines.
I can hear that. It's like this fusion of the human and the machine.
That's a great way to put it. And the pioneers of Detroit techno, these three friends, Juan Atkins, Derek May, and Kevin Saunderson, they call themselves the Belleville Three.
The Belleville Three.
Legends. They took those Kraftwerk influences, those robotic rhythms, and they infused them with this kind of soulful, melancholic vibe.
Yeah, Detroit techno can be pretty dark and intense, but there's always this heart, this soul underneath it all.
It's a sound that captures the struggles and the aspirations of a city. A city going through change, facing challenges.
I get it. It's like the music was a reflection of their reality, a way to express those complex emotions.
Exactly. But it wasn't just happening in clubs, Around this time, another musical fusion was taking place. It was going to bridge the gap between electronic music and hip-hop.
Oh, you're talking about Planet Rock.
You know it. Africa Bambaataa, he took those Kraftwerk rhythms, those robotic sounds, and he injected them with the energy of hip-hop breakbeats.
That track was huge. It blew my mind when I first heard it.
It was a game changer. It became a blueprint for electro, influenced everything from early breakdance culture to the sound of countless hip-hop tracks.
It's amazing how influential that one track was.
It showed the power of electronic music to transcend genres, to connect with different cultural movements.
It's like this chain reaction. House in Chicago, techno in Detroit, electro breaking through in New York.
The underground was alive, man, pushing boundaries, blending genres. The energy was electric.
And it was about to explode because this underground movement, it was about to go global.
Where rave era was dawning.
Raves. Now we're talking. Massive warehouses, lasers, thousands of people dancing all night long.
It was a phenomenon. And it brought with it a wave of new sounds, new experiences, a whole new culture.
So what was it like? What were these raves all about?
Imagine this. Huge spaces transformed into pulsating dance floors, lights, lasers, a sea of people moving to the music.
Sounds intense.
It was. It was about freedom, about losing yourself in the music, about connecting with others who shared that same passion.
I can see the appeal. It's like this escape from reality, this shared experience of euphoria.
Exactly. And the music itself, it was evolving at an incredible pace. New genres were popping up, each with its own distinct sound and energy.
What kind of genres are we talking about?
Well, there was drum and bass, with its breakneck tempos and intricate drum patterns. It was like the sonic equivalent of a high-speed chase. Then you had hardcore, raw, aggressive, unapologetically loud. And then there was trance, which offered this more euphoric, uplifting experience with its soaring melodies and hypnotic rums.
So many different flavors. It's like a sonic buffet for the soul. Were there any artists that really stood out during this time?
Oh yeah, tons. Ferry Corsten and Sasha, they were crafting these incredibly intricate and euphoric trance anthems. Then you had groups like The Prodigy, blending electronic beats with punk rock energy. It was raw and rebellious, and it captured that underground spirit perfectly. And of course, there was Aphex Twin, a true innovator pushing the boundaries of what electronic music could be.
It sounds like a truly creative explosion, a melting pot of sounds and ideas.
It was. And it wasn't just about the music. There was a whole culture that grew around the rave scene, a set of values, a sense of community.
PLUR, right? Peace, love, unity, respect. I remember seeing that everywhere.
It was more than just a slogan, It was a way of life. It was about creating a space where people could come together, regardless of their background, and experience a sense of belonging and acceptance.
It sounds almost utopian, doesn't it? This idea of people from all walks of life coming together to celebrate music and freedom of expression. But I imagine this kind of counterculture movement didn't always sit well with everyone, right?
Yeah, you're right. The rave scene faced its share of challenges. There were concerns about drug use, noise complaints, and, the general perception that these gatherings were dangerous.
So it wasn't all peace and love then?
Well, the authorities weren't always thrilled about it. There were crackdowns, police raids, attempts to shut down events.
It's like a classic tale of rebellion and resistance, isn't it?
It was. But despite the challenges, the rave scene continued to thrive. It was fueled by the passion of its community, and it became this symbol of resistance, a space where people could challenge the status quo and express themselves freely.
It's fascinating how music can become this catalyst for social change, this rallying point for a whole generation.
It's powerful stuff. And as the 90s gave way to the 2000s, that energy, that rebellious spirit, it was about to collide with the mainstream in a big way.
We're talking about the rise of EDM, right? Electronic dance music.
You got it. And it was going to take electronic music to a whole new level.
So from underground raves to massive festivals, what was the driving force behind this shift?
Well, a few things happened. First, the internet. It made it easier for people to connect, to share music, to build communities online. And then there were the festivals. Events like Electric Daisy Carnival and Ultra Music Festival, they were becoming huge.
Those festivals are insane. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people, massive stages. It's like a whole other world.
It was. And they became the face of EDM. These immersive experiences, these spectacles of sound and light, they drew people in from all over the world.
It's like the rave scene evolved into something even bigger, even more spectacular.
It did. And with this rise in popularity, certain artists emerged as the faces of EDM. Superstar DJs, if you will.
Like deadmau5 with his iconic mouse helmet.
Exactly. And Tisto, who brought trance to these massive stages, they weren't just DJs anymore. They were icons.
It's like they became synonymous with the sound of EDM.
And then there was Skrillex.
Skrillex. Now that's a name that changed the game.
His arrival was like a sonic earthquake. His sound, dubstep, it was heavy, aggressive, with those signature wobbling bass lines and those dramatic drops.
Yeah, dubstep was huge. It had this raw energy that just took over the dance floor.
It was different from anything else that was happening in EDM at the time, and it resonated with a younger generation.
I remember hearing dubstep for the first time. It was like nothing I'd ever experienced before.
It was intense, And it wasn't just Skrillex. You had Bassnectar, Excision, Datsig,
Mhm.
all these artists pushing the boundaries of dubstep, creating these massive wall of sound production.
Use a sonic assault on the senses in the best way possible.
Exactly.
Okay.
But even as dubstep was dominating, other artists were exploring different directions. Like Grizz, he brought this blend of funk, soul, and live instrumentation to EDM.
Grizzy is incredible. He's got this infectious energy, and his music is just, it's so much fun.
He wasn't afraid to experiment, to bring in elements of jazz, rock, even hip-hop.
It was like he was saying, hey, EDM can be more than just heavy drops and wobbling bass. It can be funky, soulful, eclectic.
And he was right. And as EDM continued to evolve, it started to blur the lines between genres even further.
So we're seeing a trend here. Fusion, experimentation, pushing the boundaries of what electronic music can be.
Exactly. And artists like Flume, Odessa, ZHU, they emerged in the 2010s, and they brought this more chilled out, introspective vibe to EDM.
I love those artists. They've got such a unique sound, this blend of electronic and organic
The
elements.
productions were lush, atmospheric, full of emotion, a nice contrast to the intensity of dubstep.
It's like a pendulum swinging back and forth. Heavy, then chilled, then heavy again.
It's that constant evolution that keeps electronic music so exciting. But it wasn't just happening in the studio, The live electronic music scene was also transforming.
Oh yeah, how so?
Well, artists like Fortet and Bonobo, they started blurring the lines between DJ sets and live performances. They were using modular synths, live instruments, looping. It was like watching a band and a DJ come together to create something totally new.
Wow, so it was this fusion of the electronic and the acoustic, the improvise and the pre-programming.
Exactly. And it was all about creating these immersive sonic experiences. But speaking of journeys, there's one artist whose impact on EDM we need to talk about.
Tim Bergling, Avicii.
His story is a powerful reminder of the human heart beating beneath the electronic pulse. He was a prodigy, a true innovator.
His music had this incredible ability to blend electronic beats with acoustic instruments, with those soulful vocals. It was uplifting, emotional. It just connected with people on a deep level.
He rose to fame so quickly. Wake Me Up, Levels, those songs, they were everywhere. He brought EDM to a global audience.
I remember hearing Levels for the first time. It was like instant euphoria. It was impossible not to move to that song.
But behind those euphoric melodies, behind the dazzling lights, Avicii was struggling.
Yeah, I remember hearing about his struggles with anxiety, with the pressure of fame, the demands of the industry.
It takes a toll.
Yeah.
And he was very open about it. Eventually, he decided to step back from live performances.
That must have been a tough decision.
It was. But he needed to prioritize his well-being.
And then, tragically, he passed away in 2018.
It was a huge loss for the music world. It sparked a lot of important conversations about mental health, about the pressures of fame, especially in the world of EDM.
It's a reminder that even amidst all the celebration, all the euphoria, we need to take care of ourselves and each other.
Absolutely. And Avicii's legacy continues to inspire. Through his music, through the conversations he started, he left a lasting impact on the world.
Avicii's story is a powerful reminder that even amidst all the celebration, all the euphoria, we need to take care of ourselves and each other.
Absolutely. And Avicii's legacy continues to inspire. Through his music, through the conversations he started, he left a lasting impact on the world.
It's incredible to think about how far electronic music has come from those early pioneers to the global phenomenon it is today.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? But the story doesn't end here. In fact, you could say it's just getting started.
What do you mean?
Well, think about it. We're at this point where technology is advancing at an incredible pace, and that's opening up all sorts of new possibilities for electronic music. New ways to create it, to experience it, to share it.
I'm thinking about things like artificial intelligence. I mean, AI is everywhere these days. Is it starting to make its way into music too?
Oh, absolutely. AI is already playing a role in music production. There are tools that can help artists generate melodies, harmonies, even entire compositions using algorithms.
Wow, so you're saying that AI could actually help write music?
In a way, yes. But it's not about replacing human creativity. It's more about augmenting it, giving artists new tools to explore ideas, to push the boundaries of what's possible.
It's almost like having a digital collaborator, right?
Exactly. It's an exciting time to be a musician, that's for sure. And AI is just one piece of the puzzle. We're also seeing a renewed interest in analog instruments and techniques.
Really? I thought everything was going digital these days.
Well, there's definitely been a shift back to the analog world. Artists are rediscovering The warmth, the texture, the hands-on experience of working with hardware synths, drum machines, all that vintage gear.
It's like this full circle moment. Electronic music started with these physical instruments, then went through this digital phase, and now there's this kind of homecoming.
It's all about finding that balance,
Hmm.
embracing the digital while still appreciating the beauty and the power of the analog. And it's not just about the tools, it's also about the way we experience music.
What do you mean?
Well, think about virtual reality. Imagine attending a concert in VR, being able to move through the crowd, get up close to the stage, even interact with the music itself.
Wow, that would be
And then
incredible.
there's 3D audio. It creates this incredibly immersive listening experience, like you're actually inside the music.
It's like the future of electronic music is not just about listening, but experiencing.
Exactly. It's about breaking down the barriers between the performer and the audience, between the physical and the digital.
It's mind-blowing to think about all the possibilities.
And who knows what other innovations are just around the corner. The world of electronic music is constantly evolving, constantly pushing the boundaries. And that's what makes it so exciting.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the evolution of electronic music, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all of this?
I'd say stay curious, keep exploring. Don't be afraid to dive into the unknown and discover those new sounds, those unexpected rhythms, those moments of sonic serendipity that remind us of the power of music to connect, to inspire, to transform.
Well said. I couldn't agree more. So to all our listeners out there, keep those ears open, keep those minds open, and keep exploring the ever-evolving world of electronic music. There's a whole universe of sound waiting to be discovered.